representation bigger?
Well, so I am very happy to be here. I'm excited. I've so enjoyed learning about the suffragists and this fight for voting rights. And I hope that you learned something tonight, because I learned a whole lot working on this presentation. So the important thing to know about the US Constitution is that each state gets to decide who gets to vote. So if you want all the women in America to be able to vote, you have to do a constitutional amendment. So because each state can give women the right to vote or not. And so that is why the 19th Amendment was required in order for all women to have the right to vote. So let's meet the women who got this constitutional amendment passed. So looking at these people here, I think you will see that these old black and white photos, the women look stern and prim and not like a lot of fun. But I want you to know that these women were fierce. They were strong and powerful and smart, and they broke all the rules about what women should and shouldn't do. And they were, you'd say they were hardcore radicals. They don't look like it, but they were. And let's move this one on. Okay, wait a second. Slides are being used up.
Here I am.
And as a result, they were ridiculed and arrested, and they were imprisoned and even tortured. And at least one woman died from tirelessly working for the cause. And the thing is, as much as I admire these largely well-to-do white women who dominate the stories that we've always heard about the suffrage movement, they aren't the whole story. They're really a small part of the story, because the fight for the vote went on for 3 generations in every state in the Union. It was led by Black women, some of whom had been enslaved, and by women of the Western states who were the first to vote, and by working women who pushed the cause through their unions. So today I want to introduce you to some of these women and their stories, and through them you will learn really what perseverance means, because sometimes we get really frustrated at how long it takes to make change. It seems like we work and work and work and nothing happens. But you have to remember that these women worked for 72 years, for 3 generations, to achieve the goal of winning the vote. So we all need to take a lesson here, that perseverance, it pays. So our story begins before the Civil War. And let me take you back to the middle of the 19th century. In the 1840s, married women did not have the right to own property, sign legal contracts, keep the wages they earned, or retain custody of their children after a divorce. So it sounds like something needed to be done about that, right? But these socially conscious women were first really moved by the plight, the outrage of slavery. And so these women really got more involved in the abolitionist movement first. But as they participated in the anti-slavery movement, many of them began to realize how their own freedoms were limited, and they began challenging a variety of ways that women were restricted. We marked the beginning of the suffrage movement with the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. And this is a conference in upstate New York that was attended by both abolitionists and those interested in women's rights. And they drafted a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments sounds like a lot like the Declaration of Independence. Well, it was. Slide, move. So here's the key sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of interest. Well, you see the difference. The actual declaration makes no mention of women. And so this was quite the radical proposition. The two women who organized the Seneca Falls convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the right and Lucretia Mott on the left, they were abolitionists, and their story was that they traveled to London to the World Anti-Slavery Convention, and then they with their husbands, and then because they were women, they were excluded. They were made to sit in a separate area, and they were furious. And so they came home and they organized this radical convention. It took them several years to get it together, which was attended by many people, including 40 men, including the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who was a strong supporter of women's rights. And so during the 20 years before the Civil War, we're talking about this era between the Seneca Falls and the Civil War, the suffrage movement grew, and it attracted some really fascinating range of women who were much less well known than the names you know of Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I'd like you to meet a few of them. Now, Sojourner Truth, you may know her and you may associate her with the abolitionist movement. And indeed, she did a lot to help escaped slaves and freed slaves. But she was a really strong advocate of women's rights. And she was born a slave in New York, and she was sold 4 times. As a young girl, she had a really violent master who beat her regularly. And she eventually ran away and was able to buy her freedom. And she married, had 5 children, and became a preacher. And then she gave herself the name Sojourner Truth. And she never learned to read or write. And yet she was important enough to be invited to the White House to meet Abraham Lincoln. And her most famous speech, and it's come down to us in various versions, and so who knows which words she really said, was this "Ain't I a Woman?" And she was an imposing figure, as almost 6 feet tall. And she talked about the struggles of being both Black and female. And if you don't know the "Ain't I a Woman" speech, you should look it up. It's really quite moving. So another woman from this era whose name you may know, but you may not know her story, is Amelia Bloomer. She attended the Seneca Falls Convention, and she was so inspired by the movement that she founded a newspaper that she named The Lily, solely dedicated to women. And this made her one of the first female newspaper editors in America. But Amelia Bloomer's biggest influence, as it turns out, and she probably didn't intend it this way, was in the area of dress reform. So you've heard of the phrase bloomers, the pantaloons that are pictured here. Well, these were really liberating clothing for women, who were wearing corsets and long full dresses. And if you see this picture of this woman on pantaloons and bicycles were a huge phenomenon in this era, and you couldn't ride a bicycle in a skirt. You needed the bloomers to ride a bicycle, and it was really liberating to have your own transportation. But this freedom dress, as it was called, was so controversial that whenever the suffragists wore it, it was so controversial that they felt like it distracted people, and they actually stopped wearing bloomers after a while. But yet Amelia Bloomer's name lives on because of this dress reform. So you probably don't know Mary Edwards Walker, and you really should, because this is this amazing woman who was a part of the suffrage movement before the Civil War. So during the Civil War, she was a surgeon. She was a Civil War surgeon, and she was captured by Confederate soldiers and imprisoned for 4 months. And she was the one, and to this day, the only woman awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And you see in this picture here, she's wearing her Medal of Honor. Well, she wore it proudly. And you know what? She kept wearing it after it was rescinded in 1917, because they said she hadn't registered as a military soldier, as if they would let her register as a military soldier. So she was given this Medal of Honor. They took it away. She wore it anyway. But the interesting thing is, In 1977, President Jimmy Carter restored the Medal of Honor to her. So she too was very interested in dress reform, and she was arrested for impersonating a man because of her habit of wearing fitted suits. You see her fitted suit on the left there. So during her widely publicized trial, she argued that she had the right to dress as she pleased in free America, and the judge ordered the police to never arrest her again. So I love her story. So the fight for women's vote took a back seat during the Civil War. The women of the North, which is where the movement was really centered, put all their efforts into supporting the Union. But then after the war, there really was the greatest blow to the women's movement, which was the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote, but not women. And it divided the suffrage movement because some people felt that if women were included, it was so controversial that it wouldn't pass and that Black men would not get the right to vote. And others were heartbroken and angry and said, hey, we've worked so hard for this, we should be included. So the suffrage forces were really divided, and it set back the movement for a couple of decades in many ways. But despite this, things were happening on a bunch of different fronts. And one of them was in the West, where women were winning the right to vote in Western states. And if you remember, I started out by saying that each state gets to decide who gets to vote. Well, so many of the Western states decided, hey, we're going to give women the right to vote. And so in 1920, when the 19th Amendment passes, 11 Western states had already given women the right to vote. So that was real progress happening. But there was another thing happening in the suffrage movement at this point, and that is that Black women were really being excluded from the movement basically for racist reasons. And as a result, African American women continued to work for the vote, but did it in their own organizations. And we're going to meet a couple of these women, and one of them, probably the most prominent this year, is Ida B. Wells. So Ida B. Wells was born into slavery during the Civil War, and she is well known as a crusading journalist and an anti-lynching activist. And you got to think of the anti-lynching movement as kind of the Black Lives Matters of that century. But she was also a really important figure in the suffrage movement. She was trying to push the women's movement to take up the issue of lynching, and they wouldn't do it. I mean, they wouldn't take on this issue. And so African American women who cared about voting and were just needed to, they decided to form their own organizations. And so Ida B. Wells, with others, formed the National Association of Colored Women, which pushed for women for voting rights, civil rights, and other rights. So the great story I love about Ida B. Wells is that when there is a huge suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913, which we'll learn more about later on in this talk, the organizers told Ida B. Wells and other African American women that they had to walk at the back of the parade. And she wouldn't do it. So what she did is she waited among the onlookers on the side. And when her delegation, which was Illinois, walked by, she joined it and integrated the parade and walked on and walked in the parade. So the other thing is Ida B. Wells. I was telling Monica at the beginning, this really is Ida B. Wells' year, 1920. The Pulitzer Prize Committee gave her an honorary Pulitzer Prize this year in honor of her crusading work on anti-lynching. And right now there is a huge public art piece on the floor of Union Station in Washington, D.C., which is a mosaic of Ida B. Wells' face, made up of images of other suffragists. And so Ida B. Wells is being widely celebrated this year. Another woman from that same, African-American woman who was involved in trying to be involved in the suffrage movement, but in an African-American organization, was Mary Eliza Church Terrell. And she was a friend of Ida B. Wells, and she also championed racial equality and women's suffrage. And she's got a really fascinating life story. She graduated from Oberlin College, which I think was the only college that a Black woman could attend in the 19th century. And she was the daughter of former slaves, and her father was a really successful businessman who had become one of the South's first African-American millionaires. So she's got quite a privileged background for someone born into slavery. And she becomes a lifelong activist, sparked, she said, when one of her childhood friends was lynched. Her words, "lifting as we climb," became the motto of the National Association of Colored Women, which she helped found with Ida B. Wells. So she really worked hard to be part of the suffrage movement. And she spoke at some of the suffrage conferences, and she even picketed the Wilson White House with the Silent Sentinels, with the white suffragists. And the part about Mary Church Terrell that I love is that she lived a long time, and she lived long enough to become an activist in the civil rights movement. And so she's a founder of the NAACP in 1909, and then she's still active in 1950 when, at 86, she joined a protest at a segregated restaurant in Washington, D.C. So 1912 to 1917, the role of women is really changing, and the tactics really need to change too. So women here are very well aware that in Great Britain, there are these really wild, radical suffragists called the Pankhursts. It's a mother and two daughters, and they use really extreme measures, including arson and bombs, to get attention. And so suffragists in the United States, they're not using arson or bombs, but some of them are saying, hey, we need to step up our tactics here. And it's interesting, beforehand we were talking about the phrase suffragist and suffragette. And suffragette was really a term of mockery in the British press. And so a lot of people, myself included, always talk about suffragists versus suffragettes. So now in this era of activism, for the first time, the suffrage movement really took to the streets. And there are parades and protests and punishment, but the suffrage movement is really divided into two factions. Those who emphasize the traditional public methods, lobbying, working through legislatures, working through Congress, and those who really believe in these attention-getting activities. And the most attention-getting of those activities was this 1913 suffrage march down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. So it was timed the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration in 1913. All these people were going to be in town for the inauguration. And the National Women's Party planned this protest. And it was the first protest march in Washington, D.C. So imagine that. It was the first protest march that had happened in Washington, D.C. You could say it was the women's march of its era. And there were 5,000 suffragists and 20 parade floats and 9 bands and 4 mounted brigades. And we probably wouldn't remember it except for the reaction that it got. The crowds around it, the men who were watching it, they crowded in and narrowed the walkway, and they pushed and tripped and sometimes violently attacked the women, and the police did nothing. And more than 100 women were hospitalized, and it was such a to-do that it totally overshadowed Woodrow Wilson's arrival in town that day. And afterwards, there were congressional hearings, And it was headlines around the country. So this parade got huge attention to the cause. And so the next thing is the women's movement was like, well, what can we do next? And so the next thing they did was the Silent Sentinels, which was the first time anyone picketed the White House. And so these women stood with their signs, and you see them at the bottom of the slide here in front of the White House, day after day through rain and frigid weather, holding their signs in front of the White House. And they did it 6 days a week for 2.5 years. They were arrested for such charges as blocking the right of way. They were sent to prison. They were mistreated. It was an amazing protest. So the woman behind this, the PR genius behind the parade and the Silent Sentinels, is this incredible character of Alice Paul. She is like a Hollywood character. She is young, she's flamboyant, and she has this incredible gift for getting in the news and recognizing what's going to work to get attention. As a young graduate of Swarthmore, she went to London and discovered that there was this far more radical suffrage movement. And so when she returned to the United States, she wanted to get involved with the suffrage movement. And she discovered that the women in the United States were a generation older than her and much more conservative in their methods. And she decided, this isn't the way. And so she and a friend that she'd met in London, Lucy Burns, founded the National Women's Party, which used these compelling tactics like the parades and the pickets. And Alice Paul, she suffered greatly for her militancy. She was arrested repeatedly. She was placed in solitary confinement in a mental ward of the prison in order to break her and to undermine her credibility. She went on a hunger strike, and which resulted in her being violently force-fed. That's what this image is showing you, the force feeding. It was her idea to do that 1913 parade down Pennsylvania Avenue and to do the Silent Sentinels. And there's one more thing you should know about Alice Paul. After women won the right to vote, Alice devoted herself to working on other ways to empower women. And in 1923, she introduced the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, the Equal Rights Amendment, the one we are still trying to get passed. And that was Alice Paul, who went right from the suffrage movement to the Equal Rights Amendment. So another really memorable figure from that 1913 parade, and one of the most famous suffragists of the day, who we don't hear much about, is this Inez Milholland Beausevain. And when I tell you the story, you're going to say, why haven't I heard of this woman? So she had the great fortune of being born both beautiful and wealthy. But she was really more than that. She was really deeply caring, hardworking, brave, and bold. And she cared a lot about the poor and the downtrodden. In 1909, she earned a law degree, which wasn't easy for a woman then, and became a lawyer specializing in labor and children's rights. She joined Alice Paul's Women's Parade and became one of the most prominent leaders. So when Alice Paul was planning that 1913 parade, she put Inez Milholland on this white horse in the front of the parade, wearing a crown. Here's, like the crown, like she was some kind of Joan of Arc. And she was a sensation, and the media loved her, which is what, Alice Paul was smart enough to know that that was what was important. And so in a couple of years after the parade, she's very famous, and the Women's Party asks Alice to go on a speaking tour of the Western states to promote this constitutional amendment. And she agreed, even though she suffers from pernicious anemia, and her family begged her not to go. She went on this grueling schedule, speaking day after day, traveling by train from city to city before reaching the West Coast. She reaches the West Coast, and she is speaking on the stage in Los Angeles, and she collapses and is rushed to the hospital. And she died a few days later, and she was 30 years old. She was so famous the news on the front page was on the front page of newspapers across America. We've got the Newark Daily Advocate here with the headline. So, and Alice Paul arranged for her memorial service to be in Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol building on Christmas Day in 1916, which I just can't even imagine how you could do that. So Inez Milholland's last words on stage in Los Angeles before her collapse were, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And those words really became the rallying cry of the suffrage movement. So another person who was involved in the Silent Sentinels is this little Mary Nolan. And I just loved discovering her because, first of all, I was looking for the local angle, and she's a Floridian. She's from Jacksonville. And she was 73 years old, and she joined the Silent Sentinels as a picket. And, you know, in the lifespan in that era, 73 was ancient. So despite her age, she was imprisoned and arrested repeatedly. And she figures really large in a famous incident at one of the local prison where the suffragists were taken, the Occoquan Workhouse, which the night that became known as the Night of Terror. And so what happened is that Mary had joined the White House pickets in November 1917. And that night, 41 women, including her, were picketing, and they were all arrested. And they were taken to the judge, and he dismissed the charges without a sentence. And so what did they do? 31 of them went immediately back to the White House and started picketing again within an hour. And they were arrested again. And this time, they were sentenced to 6 days in Occoquan prison. And so when they got there, the guards decided to teach the little ladies a lesson, and they were really violently treated and abused. Nolan was literally thrown into a cell, landing against an iron bed, and others were clubbed. Lucy Burns was shackled with her hands above her head all night. And one woman lost consciousness when her head was smashed into an iron bed. And another suffragist, seeing the assault, thought that she had died and suffered a heart attack. And so it was a horrendous scene. Mary Nolan, as soon as she was discharged, went to the National Women's Party office and dictated her account of what happened. And this was the first anyone knew. This was the first published account. And then 6 weeks later, when the women from that night went on a whistle-stop train tour to tell the shocking story, it was called the Prison Express, and they wore their prison garb. 73-year-old Mary Nolan was there wearing her prison garb. So remember how I said that not all suffragists believed in these kinds of radical protests. And so one of them who did not was Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a brilliant politician. She was the leader of the organization that believed in using traditional political methods, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And her strategy consisted of promoting coordinated state referendums. Carrie Chapman Catt is the one who founds the League of Women Voters a few months before the amendment is passed. And you know, in the end, it took both strategies. It took the Alice Paul and the parades and the pickets and the in-your-face attention-getting strategies, and the behind-the-scenes political work of Carrie Chapman Catt to achieve the goal. I have to mention that we have a really fabulous local suffrage proponent in Ivy Stranahan, who is probably Broward County's most famous pioneer. She was the first school teacher in Broward County, but less is really known about her work for women's vote. She was very active in the Fort Lauderdale Suffrage League and was president of the statewide suffrage organization in 1917. She went to Tallahassee in 1917 to lobby the legislators unsuccessfully for a state constitutional amendment. So the final years in this struggle are 1918 to 20. And finally, the tide is turned. The marches, the pickets, the imprisonments, it's all beginning to play on public attitudes. And in 1917, New York adopted women's suffrage, the first large Eastern state. And then in 1918, President Woodrow Wilson finally came out for women's voting rights. And he tied it to women's role in World War I. And so in May and June, the 19th Amendment passed both the House and the Senate. And so then the process is it has to go to be approved by 36 states, and it begins the state-by-state process. And it drags out. And so a year later, in 1920, there's one more state needed. And the Tennessee legislature is meeting and taking up the question. And this is the big moment. The pros and the cons stream into the state capital of Nashville. They lobby all day and night. The liquor companies have, which is during Prohibition, have rooms where they're like plying the legislators with all the alcohol they can drink. And the legislators, there's come with and they're wearing roses in their lapels to signify how they're going to vote. Red roses if they're against it, and yellow roses if they're for it. And this Harry Burns, he's 24, he's the youngest member of the legislature, and he came to Nashville wearing a red rose, and everybody assumed he was going to vote against. And it turns out everybody knew the vote was going to be really close. It was going to be evenly divided. So the day comes for the vote, and Harry Burns got a letter that day. Dear son, hooray and vote for suffrage. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I've been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. I do not get this phrase, rat in ratification, but it's what the letter says. It's famous. When they called Harry Burns' name in the roll call, he was a good boy, and he did what his mother asked. And thanks to Harry and his mother, the measure passed and the 19th Amendment was ratified. A week later, it was officially added to be part of the Constitution on this day 100 years ago. By the way, Florida was not one of those 36 states that ratified it. And Florida eventually did ratify it in 1969. So today, we are still inspired by the story of these bold and courageous and very persistent women. And I was going to end this talk with this inspirational statement about how long after the struggle, about how after the long struggle to win the vote, how we owed it to our foremothers to use that vote. But you know, as the centennial year has unfolded, I have learned so much about the fight for the vote. And the 19th Amendment, you know, did not bring the right to vote to so many in America. Most African-American women and men in the South were not able to vote until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Women and men who came to the United States from Asia did not win the right to vote until 1952. Native American men and women did not win the right to vote until 1947. I never realized this. Residents of the District of Columbia didn't win the right to vote for the president until 1961. And if you recall, some of you may recall, young adults 18 to 21 didn't win the right to vote until 1971. And you know, we all know there are forms of voter suppression that we are still fighting today. And so I want to kind of leave you with a different thought. I never want to hear again that women were given the right to vote. They were not given anything. They fought for it and they won it. But you know, democracy is not given to anybody. Every people and every generation must do the work for us to have a democracy. And it is our turn now to make sure that our democracy works and that it survives. And so in 2020, that most basic requirement of a democracy is for us to vote and to participate. And that's how we can honor the suffragists who came before us. So I will make a final comment, and that is, if you want to sponsor a suffragist, we have a great page on our website where we list a lot of suffragists who are going to be in this exhibit that we plan for next year at the library, and you can sponsor one and help fund this exhibit. So now I am happy to take any questions, or we can have a discussion, or I don't know what's planned.